Okay, so Fatima, whenever you're ready, go for it and I'll put the timer on.
Okay, sure. I mean, I can start now if everyone's ready.
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima Khan, and the title of my capstone project is Exploring Contested Historic Landscapes in a GIS Environment. It's a study of Lahore in Pakistan. So I've been working in urban conservation since 2007. I primarily work in the rehabilitation of the walled city of Lahore, and that's one of the main motivations for conducting this current study. And I've mostly worked with an NGO and in partnership with the local governments. So there's a lot of things that have come up in mind over the last few years that I would sort of like experiment with in this capstone project. So to start with, Lahore, if some of you are not familiar with it, it's a South Asian metropolis. It is Pakistan's second largest city with a population of around 11 million people. It is one of 36 districts in the Punjab province, which is the largest province in terms of population. That's over here, basically. It also serves as the provincial capital of Punjab. That's Lahore. The other provinces are Sindh, Balochistan, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but Gilgit-Baltistan is previously known as the northern areas, which is part of the disputed territory with India, is still spending some representation in the National Assembly. So until 1947, Pakistan was a part of India under the British Raj. The country's location between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent essentially places it at crossroads of different cultural influences, historically as well as regionally. Given Lahore's history that is set to date back 1,000 years, it can be viewed as a microcosm of cultural dynamics at large. And in this presentation, I would like to highlight some of the dynamics by applying GIS to document certain places of interest. So in today's presentation, I'll be covering 5 broad areas. I will describe the project and the proposed outcome of my efforts, which is located within the field of digital humanities or historical GIS. The project is premised around the notion of historic places and spaces as contested sites. And I will go over some examples to illustrate what I mean by this. Then, in order to locate Lahore within a wider historical region, I will quickly go over some of the key eras associated with the subcontinent at large, and then move on to a timeline of Lahore. I will return to the conceptual framework of contested sites and draw attention to 2 ways of exploring Lahore's historic landscape. That is through an examination of spatial imprints or markers, and then through a documentation of place names. I'll move on to how GIS will be applied for the purpose of developing a database or potentially a digital gazetteer, which will serve as a repository of sites that have survived different eras, but also sites that no longer exist. And the proposed database and development and data sources will be discussed accordingly. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will share certain challenges I have noted in the early stages of conceptualizing this project. And I would welcome any suggestions in moving forward. And I would also like to draw briefly attention to further possibilities and potential next steps in the long run. So this project pertains to a spatial history of Lahore with the help of GIS, whereby the city is explored through various sites at different scales. The core idea is to demonstrate how a study of Lahore, which is a dynamic and living entity, and therefore constantly changing, can be undertaken in a GIS platform. So Lahore's historic landscapes have survived different eras that are essentially seen as contested sites, which can be mapped and visualized through a layered reading of different data sources in relation to specific points of interest. So for example, Lahore at the scale of the city has transformed over several centuries from the walled city, which if one were to measure it now would be about 256 hectares. And that was the shape it got during the Mughal era, to its current expanse, which is Lahore district, and it's close to 700 odd square miles. At another level, spatial imprints at the scale of the neighborhood within Lahore exemplify pockets of urban spaces that have evolved in specific ways. And then going further in, at the level of individual places, the existence or the absence of landmark sites also entail points of inquiry to explore how historic landscapes change over time. So in this respect, the objective of the study is to apply GIS methods to record what used to be at a site, what was lost, and then what came to be over the years. And integral to the present inquiry is also a documentation of place names that provide clues to the missing places. So to the extent that place names serve as cultural repositories, linking this to other data sources sheds light on the notion of change in intangible terms. The outcome, as I would hope, would be a digital gazetteer of Lahore, and as defined by Goodchild and Hill, a digital gazetteer is basically a structured information about named places that have a particular geospatial location. So the core elements comprise of place names, geospatial location, and categories assigned to places. But in addition to these, there is a relationship between named places along with the location and the time frame for places and their corresponding descriptions, which also constitute fundamental components of digital gazetteers. So the proposed methodology broadly includes creating a database of feature layers from various sources. And archival maps of Lahore are used as a key data source to identify spaces that have undergone transformation. These will then be linked to old and current photographs and other textual material. But several challenges continue to be apparent at this stage, and I will discuss some of these with respect to conceptualizing and defining the study area, as well as defining the geodatabase for the project, steps involved in collecting and creating the data, and the rationale for classifying data in certain ways. For instance, a major constraint pertains to the acquisition of old maps and archival material from local municipal offices due to existing bureaucratic structures. And in view of this, one could ask what other data sources constitute viable alternatives to help interpret historic footprints. So in this slide and the next one, I've included examples to illustrate what I mean by contested landscapes. The first example is that of the tomb of Anarkali, which translates into pomegranate blossom in Urdu. That's the national language of Pakistan. So this tomb was erected in the early 17th century in the memory of a slave girl named Anarkali on the orders of Emperor Akbar, which is the third Mughal emperor. She is said to have been buried alive for allegedly returning a smile to his son, Prince Jahangir. So the tomb itself was constructed on the orders of Jahangir much later. So during the Sikh era, which extended from 1799 to 1839, this tomb served as a residence for one of his generals by the name of Ventura, who was originally of Italian origin, but he also served in the Napoleon's army and later on came on to modernizing the Sikh army under Ranjit Singh. And then when the East India Company annexed Punjab in 1849, the tomb was once again used as a residence and partially an office. Then by 1851, it was converted into a parish church, and presently it houses the Punjab Archives, which is a provincial government department. The second example is also of a tomb of one of the cousins of Emperor Akbar. So during the Sikh period, it was used as a residence of someone called Khushal Singh, and then by the time the British arrived, they continued to use it as a residence and added additional structures around the tomb, resulting in a colonial exterior. So this landmark site is still in use and it is currently the governor's house at present. The third example is that of the Bachay Mosque. This was erected as a congregational mosque in 1673. And during Ranjit Singh's time, which was the Sikh emperor, the mosque was used as a magazine for military purposes. And then later when the British arrived, they restored the function of the mosque. Now, all these sites are etched onto the popular imagination to varying degrees. They're easily identifiable given their scale of existence and the fact that they continue to be in use over the course of 300 to 400 odd years. And in the process, they stand out as permanent markers of Lahore's tangible cultural heritage. However, there are several instances of the complete erasure of structures or sites or entire grounds, not just physically, but from memory as well. The absence of these sites, they hint at the transient nature of historic footprints. And some of the examples that I could think of just by looking at old maps or books or directories are the ones I've included here. So, for instance, places of worship for Hindu communities that existed in Lahore before the partition riots of 1947, when there was a mass exodus of Sikh and Hindu families during one of the most violent periods in Punjab's history. So with the passage of time, a lot of sites associated with these communities have also disappeared for various reasons. So the map on the left is a British era map of Lahore, and as you can see, it indicates the Hindu cremation ground bounded in red. And the Google Earth image on the right is basically what that area looks like right now, which is densely built up. And then over here on the top right, you have an image which is known by the name of Ratan Chand's temple. This was an image that I downloaded from the British Library online gallery, but you don't see the site. I've been to that area, but there are no remains that can indicate that there used to be a temple of that size in that particular location at the moment. And what's interesting is an example of this place called Sitla Mandir, which is also another temple. The only indication I couldn't find much online, but what I could find was in a 1914 directory of the Circular Road in Lahore, which mentions this temple. So at present, when you go there, there are about 500 odd very poor families living there, and they've been living there for several decades. But if one were to look or ask for information on the temple, there's nothing there. So very briefly, the region that is now Pakistan has been subject to various civilizations, the Indus being the most well-known example from around 5000 BC. Ancient urban centers also included those of the remains of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Then you had the Greek and Buddhist influences over several centuries, and Muslim conquest in the region began sometime around the 7th century, and different Muslim rulers found their way into the subcontinent from the northwest and through Sindh. So Lahore itself is said to date back 1,000 years or so, and there are references to Lahore as early as 630 AD by a Chinese traveler. At the time of the initial Muslim invasions around the 7th century, Lahore had Hindu rulers. But from the 11th century onwards, when Muslim conquests of the regions gained ground, and on more than one occasion Lahore was destroyed or plundered. So towards the last quarter of the 16th century, during the time of the Emperor Akbar, Lahore experienced stability after he made it the capital of the Mughal Empire. Similarly, during Emperor Shah Jahan's time, several monumental structures and formal gardens came up in the 17th century, which remained central to Lahore's cultural heritage. And then over the course of the 18th century, as Mughal influence waned, Lahore sustained frequent invasions until such time that Ranjit Singh consolidated control and made it the capital of a Sikh empire between 1799 and 1839. And then by 1849, the British annexed Punjab, and their presence in Lahore became prominent over the course of the next century, and numerous colonial institutions were established. So British rule in India came to an end in 1947, and Pakistan emerged as an independent state. As a country's cultural capital, present-day Lahore is a growing metropolis with a peculiar admixture of monuments and gardens that provide testimony to past conquests and imperial grandeur of Mughal, Sikh, and British eras. And at the same time, there are concrete infrastructure and haphazard development as signs of perceived progress, along with gated communities. So in this map, this is basically showing the key influences that I'll be focusing on from the Mughal, Sikh, and British period. So as you can see in this map, the Mughal Empire extended all the way down to the orange area towards the south of India, but Lahore is located on the northwest part of the Mughal Empire. During the Sikh period over here, Lahore was the capital of the Sikh Empire that extended all the way up to the borders with Afghanistan. And this is the Indian Empire, but what I'm showing in terms of the time frame is how long the British were present in Punjab specifically, although their presence in India was dated back much earlier. So if one were to look at Lahore's urban footprint, which is the subject of this project, it's expanded from this footprint over here to the one in the middle to what we have at present. So around the 16th century, or towards the end of the 16th century, the walled city was consolidated under Akbar, with a fortification roughly shown in orange. And most of the tombs and garden spaces would have been located outside the walled city. And in the Sikh period, not many changes took place to the city itself, and they also used or recycled a lot of Mughal period buildings. But some monuments did come up around that time. Then the presence of the British in Lahore from 1849 onwards resulted in significant changes, both in terms of architecture and reconfiguration of urban spaces. And the area bounded by the yellow line is basically showing the footprint of the British rule. And at present day Lahore, it's basically one of 4 districts within Lahore division. And it contains both the walled city and the colonial period footprints, and continues to add new ones on its own. In this slide, basically what I'm trying to show is examples of footprints, and satellite imagery sort of helps to sort of see how some transformations have taken over time. So over here you have the Imperial Mosque with the presence of the fort, which is a large structure. It's about 20 hectares long, wide in area. Then you have a congregational mosque in the middle of the city. Then you have tombs surrounded by formal gardens, and then you have a formal garden in itself, which is a much reduced footprint than what might have been originally established. Then when the Sikh arrived, they had certain structures where you have the funerary complex of Ranjit Singh over here, and that's just north of the citadel, which would be somewhere here. And one of the Sikh temples of the 5th Sikh Guru. Over here you have a more ordinary kind of a temple in a village outside of the walled city, which is currently surrounded by new schemes of housing development. Then when the British arrived, for instance, the Mayo Gardens would be an example of housing for, which is this green rectilinear patch you can see, housing railway staff. Then the Lawrence Garden, in terms of its imprint, focusing more on botanical gardens, is a different kind of footprint than the Mughal period gardens. And the cantonment is a special area. Now it's part of the city life, but back then it was seen as an area that had to be separate from civilian life, where all the other military purposes or things took place. Model town is a unique experience because in the 1920s it came up as an idea based on Ibn Ezra Howard's Garden City principle. And that's a map from 1928, I think. And that's exactly what model town looks like, at least from Google Earth imagery. And in present day Pakistan, you have new forms of spatial organization focusing on low density housing mostly, and new monuments that have come up to be associated with Pakistan. So how do we then go about exploring place names? Over here, I've color coded the 4 areas roughly. So the white would be associated with Mughal era names, the orange with Sikh era names, and the yellow with British era names, and the green with what came up since 1947. So you can automatically see the difference in the kind of names. So Shalimar Bagh, for instance, would be the Shalimar Garden, which is over here. But by the time the British arrived, things changed towards having more names like Lawrence Garden, for instance, or Temple Road versus Hanuman Gully, Model Town or Minto Park, or named after British officers who were present in Lahore at the time, or the Freemasons Lodge, or the Lahore Museum, or the High Court. And it can carry on. I mean, there's a list of street names that can be identified. So I'm trying to derive both the footprints and place names from old maps and other textual material. And here are some examples of British era maps that I've found online, and some of them are found in local municipal offices. So the top two are from the internet, but this one, for instance, is a sheet. It's a drum scan of a 1907 survey of the walled city. And the one over here on the right, which I basically got very lucky in terms of getting hold of it, is also one sheet out of several others, and it's a 1940 survey of the area just outside the walled city. And I don't think anyone's used it so far for any other purposes, at least not while we've been working with the government. And here are some examples of data sources. For instance, imperial gazetteers or travel logs or memoirs, and all images of Lahore, and also some current ones. And then images that have been discussed in various blog forums, or the British Library archives, which also have sketches from all periods. The British newspaper archive is also interesting because it's got newspaper clippings or information about things like the railway in Lahore, the lunatic asylum from the late 19th century. And the idea is to develop descriptions of places from these various sources. So very briefly, the idea is to create layers by georeferencing all maps as a starting point, at least the ones that are immediately available. I plan to follow up by visiting local municipal offices to see if and how I can get a hold of other maps and archives. In this case, So the idea is to generate points, line, and polygon layers corresponding to 4 periods, that is the Mughal, Sikh, and Pakistani periods. And so, for instance, the walled city is a clearly defined entity, and we know that's associated with the Mughal era, but there were other settlements and villages. And then the idea would be to analyze the georeference layers with Google Earth imagery, which would help create further data sets, at least to the extent of identifying the current state of some of the places. I would also be using maps to compile a list of as many place names as possible. And having gone through some of the maps, I noticed that place names are extracted from maps can to some extent help identify places that no longer exist. And the cremation grounds I pointed out earlier are one such example, or even the temples. So these place names also help identify footprints or structures that were associated with certain functionalities at a point in time, but they've since relocated elsewhere. So one example is that of the Lahore Lunatic Asylum, which most likely evolved into the present-day Punjab Institute of Mental Health. So there are some old photographs are also helpful in identifying these sites that no longer exist. And in terms of trying to sort of organize them, the basic idea would be to have point layer for each of the eras, then line networks for each of the eras, and similarly polygons for each of the eras. And this is something I'll be discussing in the problems that I'm facing at the moment as well, is might be easier to identify some areas, but in terms of the city limits, there might be some conjecture involved. So over here, what you see is an example of the data layers I've been experimenting with so far. At this stage, I'm trying to compile a points layer with as many layers that one can see, and I will rely on information as much as possible online rather than get archives. I'm not planning a workflow around hard copies of archival data as yet, simply because it might take a long time to get that and might slow down my research. Here are some more examples that I have of collecting place names. These are, the jail road, for instance, is still used to this day, but the female jail, I don't think it's there anymore. The central rail has definitely relocated somewhere else. So then the idea would be to go and collect information through GPS or mobiles. These are some of the examples I have of collecting attributes. So the main challenges are about vernacular place names. I understand that gazetteers would have a structured sense of information, but vernacular place names are not necessarily standardized, or they could be available in local languages. So how does then one link that, and especially text that is not available online? And then the degree of contextualizing material from online and offline resources. Interviews are source data on specific points. And then the other challenge I'm thinking I will have is hyperlinking information from online sources that require subscription. And in an ideal world, I would be georeferencing text as well, but I'm not sure how one can go around to that. Data organization and classification is another challenge. A lot of it could be rudimentary, but we don't necessarily have start dates and end dates for a lot of those things. I'm not sure how they would be represented broadly. Some possibilities could include an interactive web map at some point in the future, but I'd be happy for any questions anyone might have. And I think that takes me to the end of the presentation.
Any questions?
Okay, I have a few questions. I have begun to explore heritage GIS. Sorry, this is from Rob Williams. I see a structure, just a moment. I have begun to explore heritage GIS. I see a tie to the archaeological group's data referencing. From Tim, are you using raster imagery, try to identify structural roads, etc.? Are you mostly referencing old maps? I will be using a combination of both. I've not been very lucky with raster imagery. I mean, my main source is the Google Earth. And yeah, I would welcome any other free sources that one could find. The ArcGIS online data resource in terms of raster imagery that I thought of could be one potential source as well. And from Justine, wow, what a lot of information. You have a lot of varied information. Thanks. And from Paul, what an interesting project. What would you think would be the central interface for users of the database? Well, I'd initially thought of a web map where people could access information and retrieve them and then use the data as open source and maybe add to it as well. But I think that might be a long stretch given that I have to create so much of the data from scratch. And I'm not sure if the timeline would necessarily allow it. Or do you plan to use a reference from the standards source? This is from Rob. This I will have to look into further. The project's attribute table could use fields from these archaeological standards organizations. Yes, thanks. I need to do further research on this, Rob, and then figure out how or which of the names that I have at least have standard source. But I don't know much about it at this point. Tim, I'm not sure how detailed OpenStreetMap is in your area, but it could be crowdfunded source of vector features. Also the Missing Maps project if it covers Lahore. The OpenStreetMap, I'll be relying on it for some of the information, at least for the current structures. I have not heard about the Missing Maps project, but I will definitely look into it. And if you can share a link or something, that would be great. And I think there are no more questions.
I think that's it for questions. Wow, that's A lot of information, but varied information. And I think you started a good structure of putting the pieces together. I learned a lot. This is a fascinating project. I look forward to seeing the end results.
Thanks, so do I. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Our next presenter is Tim. Great. I can see your slides, Tim.
And can you hear me?
Yes. So whenever you're ready, go for it.
All right. Well, so my project is called Searching for Refugees, and it focuses on correlating online search results with factors that potentially influence public support for pro-refugee policies. So just a quick overview of an introduction, briefly describe the refugee crisis and kind of the origins of my project idea. I'll go over some of the existing research on the subject of mostly public opinion related to refugees and asylum seekers, and what I hope my project could contribute to the existing research. And then we'll go over some of my kind of outlined project goals, the methodology, so how I'll get from this presentation to the next, the results I might expect from my analysis, the timeline to complete my project, and then questions and feedback at the end. So the global refugee crisis, it's been very much in the public eye and in the media in the last 4 or 5 years. I believe really starting with the European refugee crisis is, I think, when it really came onto the main stage for a lot of people in the West. But it's really a global crisis, and we have not seen the number of refugees and displaced people today since the end of World War II. So it's, while a lot of focus is on Europe, it really is a crisis all over the world. It's just a kind of a fact sheet overview from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And it basically says that we currently have over 68 million forcibly displaced people in the world. Now, my project will focus predominantly on refugees, but so with 25 million refugees versus 40 million displaced internally, 3 million asylum seekers, the definitions between these can kind of blur oftentimes, though, especially when it comes to asylum seekers versus refugees, when they cross borders, and even internally displaced people. It's easy to see how one could become another. Someone in Syria escaping government bombing, moving to a different area, as soon as they cross a border, say into Lebanon or Turkey, they immediately are now a refugee or asylum seeker. So while it's only 25 million refugees, it's really that number, the 68 million, gives you an idea of the real scope of this problem. Another widely held misconception in the West is that a lot of refugees are coming to the West or are settled in the West, and this is very much not the case, with over 85% of the world's displaced people in developing countries. The majority of refugees come from Sudan, Afghanistan, and especially Syria. But you can see on the chart on the right side, the majority of refugees are hosted in countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Uganda, and this puts quite a strain on these countries, and especially when you consider the difference in not only the income, but also just the total population and the size of a country like the United States versus Lebanon. So Lebanon is accepted for 1 million refugees. It only has about a population of 6 million people. So to put that in perspective, that would be as if the US suddenly accepted over 50 million refugees. And when you compare that to the fact that even at the height, in recent years under the Obama administration, we were accepting at most, say, 100,000. And since the Trump administration, we're now looking at somewhere in the range of 25,000. So it really pales in comparison to the strain that's been put on many of the countries often nearby these conflict areas that are taking the biggest brunt of the burden. So I like this quote from David Middleban because it kind of sums up the problem a little bit, where he says, the biggest obstacle we face in the refugee crisis is not the scale of the problem, but the sapping, nagging fear that we can't make a dent. And it kind of segues into my original thoughts on the refugee crisis, which is that while the refugee crisis is certainly a technical problem, from my perspective, it's much more political problem. And what I mean by that is that it's not that we don't have the food or the resources or the space to take care of the world's refugees. It's really a lack of political will to do so. And that especially holds true for, affluent countries that are quite large, have booming economies, and yet not only don't accept many refugees, but also don't contribute anywhere near as much as they could to countries that are hosting many of these refugees. So with that in mind, that brought me to my project idea, which is basically to try and study what are the factors affecting people's public support for refugees. And it really matters in every country, but especially in democracies, public opinion really matters and can have a very direct impact on the actual policies implemented by the government of the country. So, if you have a country where a lot of the people support accepting refugees and donating the refugees, it's just that it makes sense that they would elect more pro-refugee representatives. And so you'd see that come through in a country's policies. So public opinion really does matter quite a bit for actually trying to address this problem. So my project plan was to try and analyze the geographic variation in people's desire to support refugees against other geographic data sets. They basically look for correlations that later could be analyzed to see if they could be causal in nature. So if you have factors that seem to correlate with people's desire to help refugees. So there's quite a bit of research on the impacts of refugees and public opinions about refugees and asylum seekers. Read a decent amount, and they cover a broad variety of kind of different takes on it, but I kind of put them into two basic categories, which are, one is the effects of refugees on public opinion. So in that light, you have articles that focus, say, in the Netherlands on the effects of opening asylum centers in small local communities and seeing, does that increase or decrease people's support for asylum seekers in these areas. With that paper, surprisingly finding that these centers did not, because one might assume that smaller local communities, at least in the US, for example, often tend to lean more right on the political spectrum, and thus you might think would be less supportive of asylum seekers. But they found that once these centers opened, they actually did not find a greater opposition to asylum seeker policies in these areas. And that kind of segues into the other paper I highlight on this effect, which basically talks a lot about contact theory, which is, kind of an old idea, but the idea that people may have prejudices and ideas about a population, but once they actually live next to them and are forced to be in contact with them, whether at work or in the market, that some of these stereotypes tend to break down. People realize that, yes, they're different, but we have much more in common than we do different. But of course, there are other papers like the second one there that point to that maybe not always being the case. Maybe it depends on someone's pre-existing views, whether or not contact theory seems to hold true. Where that paper found that it didn't seem to hold as much true for people who leaned on the right side of the political spectrum. And that kind of goes into motivated reasoning about, kind of justifying your pre-existing notions. So maybe you overweight one negative experience over 5 positive experiences that justify your pre-existing beliefs. And the other category of papers tends to be trying to find correlations with existing opinions. So opinions about refugees, irrespective of whether or not people actually engage with refugees or actually have contact with refugees. So they can have a geographic element, such as the one studying the role of not in my backyard or NIMBYism on people's willingness to accept refugees. And as one might expect from other studies of the NIMBY effect, people were less likely to support refugee policies when it was proposed to open, say, a refugee center in their hometown versus just somewhere in the US in that case. And last, in that category, you have ones that are really not looking at geography at all, and it's much more about the driving factors to people who oppose refugees. So say economic threat, symbolic threat. So people that not only you have economic threat, people might be worried that refugees, you hear it in the media, will take their job or, you know, will compete for scarce resources. But you also have other effects, like symbolic threats to, say, what they perceive to be their national identity, language, their culture, things of that nature. So the one thing about a lot of that research is that most of it is based on, well, in fact, almost all of what I could find is based on surveys as a way of measuring public opinion. So my project idea is to, instead of using a survey as my raw data that I will compare things against, I plan to use Google search results using Google Trends. And while I think this has two benefits. One, where, as I said, a lot of the existing research seems on general public opinion with a stronger emphasis on negative sentiments. I plan to not only look at more positive sentiments, so people searching, you know, how can I help refugees? How can I donate to refugees? Searching for, say, pro-refugee organizations like the International Rescue Committee. But also, I think it's an interesting way to look at it because what they think about users who are much more actively engaged, people who actively want to donate to refugees or want to support refugees in their local community and are going out of their way. You know, they're not proclaiming it on social media, which also runs into my second idea of my project and why it'll help is that even as compared to, say, gauging public opinion on social media, like Twitter or Facebook, something like that, where you could potentially have kind of an ego-driven desire for people to, you know, look like they're caring or, you know, want to publicly support refugees. Online search engine results like Google are very private. People don't think of someone watching what they're Googling. So it's really just for their own use, their own kind of private desire to potentially help refugees in this case. And as we've seen in many political issues, whether in the US in particular, whether it's guns or immigration, it's often not the general opinion of the wider population, but instead the very energized opinion of a few that has a bigger impact on policy. And so that's why I'm hoping to measure the level of active pro support using Google Trends. So my main project goals are to assess whether there's any correlation between the location of resettled refugees and the desire to help refugees. So that's, you know, a little bit of a testing contact theory, see, you know, of areas that accept more refugees, say states that accept refugees, do they also have more pro-refugee searches, people wanting to find out how they can help refugees? And then also search for correlation using those same searches between other geographic data sets, looking for potential correlations between, you know, wanting to help refugees and household income, political party affiliation, demographics, say ethnic diversity of an area, crime rates, and different data sets like that. Basically searching for correlations in the data. And you know, I'm not a statistician myself, so my goal of this project isn't to go so far as to try and prove causation, but more just to highlight potential causation that could warrant further research on the subject. So methodology, how am I actually planning to do this? So first and most importantly is the Google Trends data, since that's the raw data for the whole project. So Google Trends is freely available to anyone. However, it's somewhat limited in that the results it gives you are only relative to themselves. And by which I mean, if you were to search help refugees, it'll show you over your study period, over your time period that you specify, the most or least search times, but only relative to the most search time for that term. And while that may be helpful for studying one term, it makes it much more difficult to compare terms to each other and really add them in a quantitative sense. So I applied and was given access to the Google Trends API, which is only for nonprofits and researchers. And so my first task is going to be to really get into that system, learn how to use it, learn how to get the data I want. It's Python based, which I have some familiarity with, but I'm sure it'll still take some time to get into the system and learn it, and also kind of honing down the search terms I'll use for Google Trends. So they are inclusive. So if I put help refugees, it'll also return people who type, how can I help refugees? So understanding the way that the search is applied will be helpful in this. And the geographies that I can get back are by the state level, metro areas, or cities. So refugee resettlement data. I've looked at sources at State Department and the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the United States. They have year-by-year resettlement data for refugees that are accepted to the United States. However, I haven't been able to find this data on anything more precise than the state level, unfortunately, which is not as precise as I would like to really test my contact theory, but at least so far as I can find, it's the best that I've found. I haven't been able to find it broken down, say, by county or by metro area. So I'm still going to look for that, but worst comes to worst, I'll use the state data, and I can pull out the Google Trends data by state as well. Then the other comparative data sets I hope to compare to the search results. So first, American Fact Finder by the US Census Bureau is a great resource for a lot of the demographic data that I'm hoping to compare against. So they have it for the whole country based on, say, average household income, the ethnicity of different areas, broken down by different ethnicities in those areas, average age, and educational attainment. And that's broken down by, I can get it by county, which is what I currently have downloaded, and I'll look into best match for the Google Trends metro areas, because their cities, it's not comprehensive, it doesn't cover the whole country. Their metro areas do, so there's no gaps, but I'm gonna try and figure out what output geography from the American Fact Finder best matches the metro areas, and I'll likely have to do some resampling to get those to match up. And then crime, I thought might be an interesting data set to compare, just based on, you hear a lot in the media about people not wanting to accept refugees because they're worried about crime and terrorism. So it could be interesting to see, do areas that have higher crime rates have more or less support for pro-refugee policies. Kind of a meta idea to look at is comparing pro-refugee searches via the Google Trends API to negative refugee searches and see if there's correlation there. You might naturally expect that the areas that have the most searches for people wanting to help refugees might also have the fewest help or wanting to stop refugees. But it could be interesting to see if that's maybe not the case. If you maybe have hotspots where there's areas where there's a lot of searches for both, it could maybe show that refugees are just a hot button issue in that area, and both positive and negative. So it'll be interesting to see if those two terms correlate with each other at all. And last, political affiliation. I'm actually still searching for a good data set on that. It's a little bit harder than I expected to find something on, say, the county level on, and whether that's registered Democrats and Republicans or more survey type results of just, what way you lean. I'm hoping to still find something on the county level, but if I have trouble finding that, I could always fall back on, say, congressional district representation in the House as kind of a loose way to correlate what areas likely have more support for Republicans, say, versus Democrats. And then the analysis itself. So I'll be planning to use ArcGIS Pro for most of this analysis. The first step, as I said, after I download all the data, will be to clean it up and normalize it with each other, make sure all the geographies match up. So whether that's resampling counties up to metropolitan areas or whatever input I get from the census and that I decide to use, that looks like it'll match best. As I said, the refugee resettlement likely will be based on the state, so that's a pretty easy comparison. And then I'm planning to use the spatial statistics toolbox to do the analysis. And really the majority of my analysis right now in my head is actually not so spatial in nature. I'm thinking it a bit more in a statistic sense, where I'm really comparing to look for correlation between results within, say, each metro area, less so than the effect of one metro area on adjoining metro areas. So a lot of the work in GIS is mostly preparing and getting ready for the analysis. But it could also be interesting to see if there is a spatial correlation between some of these variables. So say are areas that have the most searches for people wanting to help refugees spatially correlated where areas nearby are also more likely to search for these, and vice versa. So, and last, I may use, it was introduced to R in 586. I know it can be a pretty powerful statistics tool. So I'm going to start in Pro, but if there's some analysis I'm having trouble getting done in Pro, I may switch to trying to use R. And expected results. So overall, I actually don't expect to see much correlation with the refugee resettlement populations and pro-refugee searches. That's not so much because I don't believe contact theory exists, but more just that, as I said at the outset, the number of refugees the United States accepts really just pales in comparison to the total population. So it's very low on a per capita basis. So especially if I'm limited to the state level and can't get, any more precise than that, I just don't necessarily expect to find that, say, even 5,000 refugees resettled in Arizona has a dramatic or noticeable effect on public opinion in Arizona otherwise, which, has many, many more people than that. But it'll still be interesting to check and see if there is any correlation there. One might wonder if areas that accept more refugees also are more supportive of refugees. But I don't believe that's the case, only because as of right now, local areas and states don't really have as much of a say of where the federal government resettles refugees. There's some conservative lawmakers trying to change that, but as of right now, they don't really get to pick and choose what states accept them and don't. And data sets I do expect to show some correlation would be political party affiliation, of course, with expecting a more positive result from areas that lean left and vice versa for places that lean right. Ethnic diversity, you might expect, and I would expect areas that are more diverse to show more support, but I'm not sure if this is the case. And also there's the possible negative counterweight between, there's some research actually depressingly showing that areas with higher diversity, whites in those areas are less likely to support, say, pro-immigration sentiments. So it could be interesting to look at that as well. Education, I expect to see positive, and age as well, with younger areas tending to be more supportive, but the results will have to show. And then there's the unknowns, where household income and correlation with anti-refugee searches. So it really have to wait and see if there's any correlation that comes through in those. And last, the real remaining question for me is, what is the value of a snapshot comparison, like a snapshot in time versus analyzing change over time? Because this is a relatively wide project, I'm at the moment focusing on trying to analyze data sets that cover the whole country. It could have a noticeable increase in the amount of analysis required to pick two times to do a change over time, but I don't know if there's a much greater value to that versus a single snapshot in terms of showing correlation that would make that worth it. So that's something I'm still looking at. So the timeline, I've submitted to apply or to present my my project at the 2019 Esri User Conference in California in July. So while I won't know for a bit if that's accepted or not, working with that assumption, I plan to spend the rest of December kind of incorporating feedback I receive on this presentation, kind of finalizing that. January and February, I want to really dig into the Google Trends API and make sure I get all the data that I need for that, as well as all the other associated data I want to analyze against and get everything cleaned up and ready. March and April, I want to actually do the analysis itself, looking for correlation, looking for spatial correlation, and of course I expect some analysis to lead to others. So I'm going to leave a couple months for that, and then May and June, I'm planning to actually develop my presentation and report prior to the actual presentation in July. And that's basically it. So I'd be very happy to hear any feedback or questions people have. So Paul asked, have you considered looking at the number of refugee support groups in metro areas as another measure of how likely the public is to be aware of refugee presence? No, I have not, and that's a really fascinating idea, given that you could definitely see that the more NGOs in an area, they might be actively reaching out for support and for donations. So it might make it much more part of the ether and the public discourse. So that's definitely something I'll look into. It's a good idea. And Fritz asked, given that most socio-demographic data is correlated to some extent, how are you going to account for this in your regression analysis? So that's very, very true. As I said, this is definitely a learning project for me because I have little to no background in statistics. So that's some of what I'm hoping to spend my time over the next half year doing, is not only doing the analysis, but then trying to control for socio-demographic data. Like, is there just simple correlations between areas that are, say, wealthier and more likely to have these searches, but maybe they have more means and it has nothing to do with their actual desire to support refugees. So I haven't nailed that down yet, but that's something I'm very wary of, and that's why I'm reading some books on statistics right now, and I'm going to be trying to do my best to make sure I don't make any statistical errors in my analysis or say more than I should. And then question, I might have missed it, but will you be looking at public opinion and refugee source country? Public education is the key at the public school level, given that 50% of refugees are under age 18 years old. Yeah, so that's very true, that most refugees being young people. How I look at public opinion in refugee source country, so that data is available in terms of the resettlement data from the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the State Department. You can see where the refugees are from. So that is something that, while I haven't, my plan was to look first at the general numbers to see if there's any correlation there just between the general numbers and people's desire to help. But it could also be interesting because that data is available. So I could use that to say, well, this area maybe accepted just as many refugees, but most of these refugees were from Afghanistan versus most of these were from Sudan or Myanmar. So it could be interesting to look at the differences there, depending on, so that's a good idea as well. Thanks a lot. Would you incorporate temporal data related to refugees? That kind of, assuming you mean changes over time of the number of refugees coming in, say accepting less this year than the previous year, or the changes if it's a certain area suddenly receives a lot more. That kind of goes into that last question I asked, which is, what is the value of changes over time? I do kind of have a feeling that I should probably try and do that, because I could definitely see a lot of value in, say, an area, that suddenly accepts a lot of refugees versus not, or an area that's always accepted a lot of refugees, and then seeing if there's a change in time. That might also be a better way, a change in time, to potentially, if other factors stay the same, maybe somewhat going to Fritz's question as well about kind of controlling for other factors. So if the income in an area stays constant, but the number of refugees doubles that come into that area, or halves, if you see a change in public opinion, it of course won't mean causation, but it could be more meaningful. So I think I will probably likely include temporal data for this analysis and do snapshots in time and try and compare changes. And if that's all the questions. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Jim, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, there you go.
Justine's having some technical difficulties, so there we go. We can see it and start when you're ready.
Okay, let me start the slideshow here. Okay, well, thank you, Beth. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for this peer review session. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Jim Detweiler, for guiding me through this project. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Blandford for putting me together with Jim, because Jim had some really great ideas and suggestions as I started formulating this idea. And I'm quite sure now, with his help, that this is really going to be a successful project. So the title of my presentation is an intergovernmental GIS web application for zoning and subdivision regulatory review in Suffolk County, New York. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Jim Daly. I'm the GIS manager for the Suffolk County government located in Suffolk County, New York. Suffolk County is on the eastern half of Long Island, and of the 62 counties in New York State, it is the second largest area-wise, and it has a population of about 1.4 million people. I happen to live in the western portion of Suffolk County in the hamlet of Huntington. So a little bit more information about myself because it is relevant. I started my career in the Suffolk County Planning Department and started doing GIS support for the planning staff there. So I'm well versed in a lot of the planning workflows. And this is relevant for the application as I explain it going forward. And then eventually in 2006, I was moved out of planning and began, I created the GIS division in the county IT department and began supporting GIS for all of the departments in Suffolk County. So what's on the agenda for today? Well, first I'm going to go over some background info that I hope will help you understand what it is I'm trying to accomplish here. And then I'll discuss the problem that I hope to resolve with this application. And then I'll talk about my research, state my objectives, show you my planned methodology to create the application, and we'll do a little SWOT analysis. And then I'll wrap it up with a timeline on how I plan to complete, or how much time I think it's going to take to complete this project. So first, a little background. What's this all about? Well, it all begins with the great state of New York and its general municipal laws. So general municipal laws, also known as GML, are directed at municipalities within the state. And all the municipalities in New York State have to adhere to these laws. So my project specifically relates to GML 239M and 239N. And these two laws are directly related to land use controls. Both of these laws are exercises of a municipality's police power. Specifically, these land use controls are zoning and subdivision. Zoning dictates what the land may be used for, i.e. commercial, residential, industrial, etc. And subdivision relates to how the land is used, and basically just to make sure that adequate services are provided along with the proper facilities. So while zoning and subdivision controls are entirely separate police powers, the review process is almost identical, and so 239M and 239N have become simply known as the GML 239 review process. So what is the purpose of GML 239 review? Well, the state of New York wants to ensure that all the local board members in the municipalities are being considerate regionally or county-wide, and are just paying attention to what the potential impacts are on the county, not just within their local municipality. So for example here, you see that I proposed a property in the town of Islip. Let's just say this resident depicted in the orange parcel would like to subdivide. They would put a request into the town of Islip for subdivision. The town of Islip would review it and determine whether or not this property needs to go before GML 239 review. And if it did, it would further invoke county involvement. But again, the purpose of the New York State law here is to make sure that each of the municipalities are good neighbors to each other. And that's why this 239M and N are also known as the good neighbor laws. So what does GML 239 review require a municipality to do? Well, if certain spatial conditions are true, then GML 239 requires the municipality, also known as the referring body, to refer the proposed action to the county planning board for review before they can make their decision. This referral is known as GML 239 review. So what are the spatial conditions I just mentioned? Well, when the subject property is within 500 feet of another municipality, or within 500 feet of Suffolk County parks, roadways, owned land, or any stream or water drainage within Suffolk County, or within 500 feet of New York State park, roadway, owned land, or agricultural district. And also within 1 mile of an airport or a heliport. So all of these spatial conditions all have to be accounted for, and they're all known as the jurisdictional requirements data. So henceforth throughout the presentation, when you hear me refer to the jurisdictional data, this is what I'm referring to. So who's who in the review process in Suffolk County? Basically, the county planning agency is the Suffolk County Planning Commission. The referring body could be any town planning department or incorporated village planning department. And just so you know, there are 10 townships and 32 incorporated villages, which means that there are 42 municipal agencies to coordinate with Suffolk County Planning Commission for 239 review. What happens if a referral is needed? Well, to go back to my example with the town of Islip, the occupant or the resident would apply, and then the municipality would, if it determines that it meets this criteria, it would then send the county a referral for them to give their opinion on. And if it has regional impacts, it'll go to the Planning Commission where they'll determine whether or not it can be approved. This can be challenged. It can be challenged with an Article 78, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And if it has no regional impacts, it'll just be sent back to the municipality where they'll make a local determination. So who's involved here? Well, the project stakeholders really come down to 4 entities. With the exclusion that the municipalities consist of 42 entities, but let's just keep it simple here, putting all the municipalities into one bucket. The stakeholders here are the Suffolk County Planning Commission, the Planning Department, which is really the worker bees for the Planning Commission, and then there's the IT department, my department, that would support or is supporting the application and will support the Planning Department. And then there's all the municipalities within Suffolk County that hopefully will partake in the use of the application and collaboration. So presently in Suffolk County, GML 239 review is an uncoordinated process. This has been proved by the fact that what exists right now, as I did my research, is that the Suffolk County Planning Department in years past has put out a jurisdictional map, which is a PDF map, nothing more than really a wall map. Most local planning departments print it out and put it up on their wall. And this is how they locate a subject property to determine whether or not it falls within 239 review. As you can see, it's extremely difficult to locate the property accurately, and you know, the old joke is if you want to zoom in or zoom out on this application, you just have to walk up or step back from the wall. A centralized authoritative source of the jurisdictional requirements data has not been established, and that's a big problem. So all these different review departments reviewing for the same process are not using the same data. That's perhaps one of the biggest problems in this whole review process. So what we're trying to do here is get them to all use the same version of the same data. So the problem. County and local municipal planners are not able to use a centralized environment where they can make spatially accurate real property determinations and collaborate for efficient GML 239 review. That's the heart. And this is what we're trying to solve here. And trying to create the application, we believe will solve this problem. So validating the problem. Is it a real big problem? Well, in my research, I went back to my old stomping grounds, and I interviewed the chief planner there, Andrew Freeling. And when I explained the idea, he was all excited about it. And he said it has great potential. He believed that it could be used immediately as soon as I had a prototype working. And he was very much excited about it. He even said that this application, if it goes county-wide, could really help all the towns start to reduce Article 78 challenges, which I mentioned earlier. And what an Article 78 proceeding is just a it's a device, I guess, that the public or any other municipality can use to challenge the procedure of a 239 review. So evidently in the planning departments throughout Suffolk County, this happens quite a lot. So the feeling is that this type of application could actually reduce that. This brings me to my colleague Dave Genoway in the town of Huntington. And if I could take a time out here, I'd like to say thanks to Dave, because Dave was the one who really gave me the idea for this application. At the time, I was at a meeting with the county planning department where Dave was invited from the town of Huntington. And as I was sitting in the room, he inquired about, could I make him a data service for all the county jurisdictional data that they're using in the planning department? And I thought about that, and I said to myself, well, I think I can make it one better. Coupled with the fact that at the time I was taking 583, which Dr. Blanford's class, system analysis and design, and bingo, that was the idea I was looking for there. So it all started there a few years ago with that meeting with Dave. When I brought the idea to Dave in the town of Huntington, he was also very excited about it, and he thought that anything that the county can provide that can help the towns comply with this review process would be extremely beneficial. And then I went up as far as to the top, to the state level, and I had an interview and a couple of conversations with Frank Winters, who's the New York State GIO. And I've known Frank for many years, and I brought this idea to him, and I said, you know, I'm formulating this prototype here in Suffolk County. What do you think about scaling it statewide? And he was very receptive to the idea. But when we started talking about data and data requirements, for 62 counties, we started talking, and said it would be a little bit of an effort, but none that he would be willing to back away from. And he was excited about the idea of potentially starting with Suffolk County as the prototype, as the guinea pig, if you will. So in my research, I also went out and I asked the question, does this application presently exist somewhere? And again, starting from the top, at the top level of government in the state of New York, in my conversations with Frank, he definitively said no, he wasn't aware of any such application. But they do, the GIS office does have a product called Share GIS, which is basically becoming, or will become, the state GIS portal. And his thinking was that this is potentially where we could sit this application and deploy it statewide, should we come up with a successful working model. And at the very least, we believe that this could be a hosting site for the jurisdictional data as a data service, which would be extremely beneficial to a lot of departments that can consume data services for GIS. But the big con, the big negative here is that Share GIS is not really it's not in production right now, and it's not ready to be used. It's being kind of held up with some legal contracts, and Frank's in the middle of solving those, and potentially, again, this could be the application site where it's deployed at the state level. Looking around at the other counties in New York State as well, couldn't find anything, but the best thing I did come up with was Broome County has a GIS portal that I thought did answer something to the effect of GML 239. So as you go into the GIS portal and interrogate the parcels, you can click on a parcel and get some information. You can dive a little deeper, and it gives you a form, and it does give you information about 239 review. That's a real good positive. It's an open application, but unfortunately it's not collaborative, it's not interactive, and the review is pretty much one-sided. They've done all the geoprocessing for those particular parcels, and they're giving you the determination, but you really just have to take their word for it. So we're looking for something a little bit more. And then looking locally here in Suffolk County, I reached out to all the municipalities, and no one really had anything like that. They're still using the wall map, except for the town of Southampton now, who has put together an in-house application. And this is called their referral module. It pretty much does a great job identifying what the town has to do to ensure 239 review. They're trying to get rid of Article 78 as much as they can. But it's not collaborative in the sense of intergovernmental collaboration. So it's strictly internal use behind the firewall in the town of Southampton. And it's a very complex app, but nonetheless, I believe it has a lot to offer, and I'm certainly going to be investigating the programming behind this application, because I think it's going to be beneficial to what I want to create here for Suffolk County. So what are my objectives? Well, I'm working to produce a prototype of the application. That's the primary objective. Get something working by the beginning of April or March, and have the planners use it. so that we can get a good indication of whether or not this is really going to have a footing in Suffolk County and begin fully collaborating with 239 review. So I want the Suffolk County Planning Department to collaborate with at least 2 municipalities for this application by the end of the project, and I've identified the town of Huntington and the town of Southampton. These 2 towns are amenable to work with me to facilitate the application, have a look at it, see how they can work with the County Planning Department for 239 review. So I'm excited to work with these 2 towns. The secondary objective, and I spoke to this already, is basically scale it out up to the state level. Now, I don't expect to accomplish this by the end of my project, but it is something that I will be carrying forward. When I'm done at the end of this project, this application does not go away. I'm going to be still working on it. I'm still probably going to be doing enhancements to it and doing my best to make it work, if not just for Suffolk County, but again, working with the state. I feel there's a future here for this application at the state level, and I'm going to do my best to see to it that the GIS program office at the state level can facilitate for me. And eventually, my goal here is to have all counties and local governments in New York State use this application or a form of it from Albany. And being that I have some history on the New York State Geospatial Advisory Committee, one of the things we did was we had a great deal of discussion of how we can extend GIS use to a lot of the local municipalities and governments that really are limited or have none GIS capability. So this would be a great product, and this is what Frank was excited about, Frank Winters, the GIO, about doing. This is exactly the type of application or the type of information product that he's looking to, so that he can make good use of his GIS platform at the state level. So a little bit about my methodology. This all begins with the Suffolk County Web GIS platform, and then we bring in ArcGIS Online to deploy it. Yes, we had to bring in ArcGIS Online solely because to deploy this through the firewall and into the public cloud somehow, the most convenient way at this point, because Suffolk County is an Esri shop with an enterprise license agreement, we have an organizational ArcGIS Online account. So we're able to deploy applications and data into ArcGIS Online for outside people to consume. We can do this securely, provided that the outsiders do have an account. So that would be one of the drawbacks, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes. But it basically consists of creating a database, building the web API, and then testing it, and then deploying it. So the application platform, it's a hybrid platform. It consists of the county web GIS behind the firewall, and also relies on ArcGIS Online, which is our public cloud, if you will. So if we just look at the Suffolk County Web GIS platform, this platform is already built. It consists of ArcGIS servers. It has the enterprise geodatabase. We replicate with the Suffolk County Planning geodatabase, which will soon be part of our geodatabase anyway, so replication will probably go away there. We're going to provide a jurisdictional data service, which will be able to be ported through the firewall into ArcGIS Online. And of course, I'll have a GIS web server that will be able to do that. The other half of it is Esri's ArcGIS Online. We'll be using that. This is using our GIS organizational account. We're going to host the application in Esri's ArcGIS Online. And this is where it will consume the data service from our ArcGIS server behind our firewall. And this is actually going to be where the access point is for the municipality planners and the county planners to collaborate for 239 review. So this is where the magic happens. Okay, so a little bit about the data and the data requirements. As I mentioned earlier, there's jurisdictional data, and that has to be checked for positional accuracy. But if we could start with jurisdictional data, all of those data sets that I mentioned earlier have to be identified, created, and although you see roughly 8 bullet points here, that this represents quite a lot of data that still has to be developed. And then once it's developed or it's actually identified and located, it all has to be checked to make sure that it aligns with the tax parcel layer. And that's important because basically when 239 review happens, it's all based upon a tax parcel. So that's the reference point for the accuracy for the data. Next comes building the web application, the API, the application programming interface. We're going to stick with HTML5. We're going to use the JavaScript language as well. And I'm going to begin with Esri's web app builder template and then customize that for this application. So there will be some customization involved in this whole application. And then there's testing the application. Well, the application has to be tested, the API itself, the interface, make sure that everything's connecting correctly. We have to make sure that we got the data service working and all the geoprocessing tasks that are involved in the application are working, such that when you're locating a subject property that you're going to be able to find it and get the right review back. We have to look again at the spatial accuracy. We have to consider the coincident geometry with a tax map layer. And then we have to look at the positional accuracy of environmental data that doesn't have coincidence with the tax map layer, that is the reference layer. So we have to make sure that these environmental data sets, as you may recall I mentioned earlier, are things like streams and potential water outlets. So we have to make sure that those are positionally accurate in reference to the tax map layer. So just to take you through it real quick, the idea, the concept, a municipal planner, any planner would open this application, begin at the county extent. Let's just say, for example, sticking with our example with the town of Islip, selecting Islip as their municipality. That would take you to the extent of the town of Islip, where you then be able to enter your address of your subject property, which would then zoom you into that subject property and give you a pop-up or a readout of what is required for 239, whether it falls in, is required or isn't. And if it is, you would be able to generate a report. In either case, you should be able to generate a report for what the potential impacts are, or excuse me, what that property might impede upon, which of the criteria causes it to be required for 239 review. And then next, finally, is deploying the application. And this is really nothing more than just making it accessible. Once it's tested and proven successful, we just basically open it up through ArcGIS Online, make it available to the municipal planners. Ideally, at first, I know I have the town of Huntington and town of Southampton have ArcGIS Online accounts, so collaborating securely in this environment is not an issue for them. And we're looking forward to doing that. But what you should be aware of is that the application at the heart of it is the county, the local municipality planners working with the county planning department. And this is where we'd like to see the collaboration for 239 review happen. So as I said, we'd like to do a little SWOT here. The strengths of this application, perhaps the greatest strength, is that the WebGIS hybrid platform exists. We're ready to use it. So that's a big strength for us here. The support from 3 levels of government. We've got, as I've stated, we've got the town of Huntington, the town of Southampton, and the state of New York working. And we also need $0 to start to build a prototype. Some of the weaknesses, well, it requires Esri's ArcGIS Online, and that's a licensing cost issue, which could become a potential problem as I want to scale it out later on to a great deal of municipal planners. So that may not have ArcGIS Online accounts. And the positional accuracy of the jurisdictional data may be a problem, but that should be cleared up as we move forward. No coordination of the data maintenance, that's another issue. I'd like to work with the planning department and perhaps the state of New York with coordinating data that's required for the judicial review, for the 239 review. Opportunities, I think we have a lot of them here. Efficiencies in 239 review, definitely going to be there. Improved collaboration between the municipalities and the county for sure. Reduction in lawsuits, Article 78 proceedings. Improved government transparency and scalable to all New York state counties. Hopefully, keep my fingers crossed. The threats, I really couldn't find many, but the ones that I did think of was perhaps the greatest threat might be just that there's an unwilling of most local planners to change their workflow process. And I've seen this before in my years in the county and working with government officials. They're set in their ways. And lastly, one of the threats I think could be to this project is that if Suffolk County drops the Esri ELA, which I can assure you, I don't think that's going to happen because we've got so many mandated applications that are associated with Esri applications. the Esri products. So the timeline for this, well, I've already started to create the jurisdictional geodatabase, working with the planning department. So I'd like to have that created and done by January. I'd like to have the web API created in February sometime, and then begin testing it at the end of February into March, deploy it in March, begin to collect some feedback as early as early March and April, and then make any last minute adjustments if I have to. And then basically leave the product out there. If it's not a liability, if it's not an issue, if it's not causing a problem or confusion in the whole process, then I'd like to leave it run, and then present the findings and the application at the conference, whether or not it's successful or not. I'm betting on that it will be successful, but that's my bet. Okay, so what are the anticipated results? Well, the first one is that county and local planners will use the application to start, and that they're all going to be using the same source of authoritative data. That's one of the most important things I'd like to see happen. Secondly, I think as a result of this, there's going to be improved intergovernmental collaboration for 239 review. And some people that I've spoken to about this idea think that this could actually foster intergovernmental collaboration for many other areas as well. Once you start talking to other agencies on one issue, you begin to develop conversations on other issues as well, so things begin to grow. So that could be a good positive consequence of this application proposal. Also, I foresee that workflow efficiencies for both the county side and the municipal side will happen as a result of the application. Again, I think there's going to be a decrease in lawsuits and Article 78 proceedings, because this application will be able to prove that it was not procedurally defect, or it could show where the procedural defect was. So we believe that will help. And I also believe it will extend GIS technology to government agencies with limited GIS or no capabilities for GIS. So that's one of the greatest benefits, I think. And if it does become open to the public, which I do foresee happening in my discussions with Andrew Freeling and Frank Winters, we think that this is a great application because it really is geared towards the government, to the resident. So in that sense, it makes sense to open it up and make this process transparent for them. So government transparency is one of the anticipated results as well. So I plan to present this project and the application at the Spring 2019 Elijah's Conference, which will be held in Farmingdale, New York at the Farmingdale State College. And I think the date is tentatively set, no, I'm sure it's I'm sure it's set for April 19th of the upcoming year. And so I'll be there. If anyone's on Long Island, I welcome you to attend the Elijah's Conference. And I want to say thank you and open it up to questions. Okay, so from Paul, have you considered eventually creating a simpler web app, maybe open source, for the public-facing component? That might be more cost-effective than the Esri solution. Yes, Paul, thank you. I have considered that, and in my discussions with the state GIO, that's one of the things we were talking about, because he is being killed with licensing costs from Esri. So if any of you are familiar with Esri's new licensing model, it's all account-based, user-based, and these accounts are just costing millions to Frank. And we talked about moving this into an open source environment, and he's begun to take on developers in his shop and work with open source GIS software. So that's probably, if Frank takes hold of it from here, from Suffolk County, that's probably what he's going to look to do, because I think he's also looking to move away. Maybe I shouldn't say this out loud to let Frank speak for himself, but the Esri costs are definitely a constraint for facilitating this type of application. Thank you, Paul. It's a good question. From Tim, have you looked into hosting this on a portal? Esri now offers unlimited level 1 users for portal, which may help the cost concern when expanding beyond your department. Yeah, another good question, Tim. Thank you. We're in my department in the county, we're exploring leveraging portal to the outside. So we're actively pursuing Active Directory Federated Services, otherwise known as SAML technology, which will allow our portal to be extended through the firewall. So we're re-architecting with our cybersecurity officer, and we're in the process of doing that. And yes, I do have that idea to do this so that we can make it more cost effective. And with level 1 users, that was big with me in my shop. When level 1 users went free, that was huge, because we had built our architecture based on basically unlimited products, not unlimited users. And when Esri switched that, we had a big problem with that. So yeah, portal is something that we're ready to deploy, and I may use that for this product as well. Thank you.
That looks like it for questions.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks very much. And thank you, Jim, and thank you, Dr. Blanford.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget to fill in the peer review, and have a good Christmas break, and best wishes for the new year.